The drops began before dawn, fat, heavy beads of moisture that fell not from clouds, but from the leaves themselves. Every surface in the jungle breathed water. The soil was slick like soap, and the trees oozed with a film of condensation that never seemed to dry. By the time the first light filtered through the dense emerald canopy of Varela 3, the camp already looked as if it had been soaked for weeks. The air was thick enough to chew. The cadets, wrapped in blankets that had turned into wet rags, woke to the same dismal chorus. The hiss of steam, the drone of unseen insects, and the crack of something collapsing in the distance. Evan Clark sat on a fallen trunk, his hands folded, eyes tracing the ripples on the puddles that covered the ground. He had not slept much. No one had. But unlike the others, his exhaustion carried no panic. Around him, alien cadets stumbled through the mud, cursing in a dozen dialects as their shelters folded in on themselves like wilted flowers. The reptilian Threxians had tried to build huts from broad fronds and clay, assuming the structure would harden overnight. Instead, the clay had melted back into sludge, swallowing their supplies. The avian Zyri had woven nests between tree branches high above, but their feathers and twigs now hung limp and dripping, too heavy to hold their weight. The insectoid Vorax had created intricate hives sealed with resin, yet the heat had softened their glue until their walls slumped like melting wax. The Academy's challenge had sounded simple when the instructor had announced it back on the shuttle. Survive for 1 month in Varela 3's jungle. Build your own shelter, find food and water, and return with proof of endurance. The cadets had laughed. They were trained, intelligent, and equipped with scanners, knives, and ration cubes. What could a jungle possibly do to them? But by the first night, most had learned that the jungle did not attack. It simply waited. The humidity was its weapon. Nothing dried, nothing stayed solid. Everything, given enough hours, turned soft, sour, or rotten. Evan had arrived with the same confidence as the rest. He was human, the only one among the 15 cadets in this section. The others had looked at him with curiosity and faint condescension, as if wondering how something without scales, armor, or feathers could last in such a place. On the first day, he had helped a Zyri named Velra carry logs for her shelter, but when she saw him spacing the beams too far apart, she laughed and corrected him. "You humans still think air is your friend," she had chirped, arranging the leaves tightly so no rain could enter. "You'll learn humidity is not like water. It creeps through gaps." Now, on the second morning, Velra's shelter sagged into the mud like a dead creature. The air inside was hotter than outside, and mold had already bloomed in streaks of green and white across the inner walls. She stood before the ruin, feathers plastered to her skin, and let out a cry of disgust. Evan approached quietly, scanning the wreckage without speaking. He noticed the smell, sweet rot, the scent of overripe fruit mixed with decay. He took a deep breath and memorized it. To most, the jungle was a punishment. To him, it was a teacher. The longer he stayed, the more he saw patterns. Water dripping from specific vines every few minutes, leaves curling only at certain temperatures, fungus expanding where shade lasted longest. Every mistake others made became a lesson for him. When the Threxians rebuilt their hut using thicker leaves, he saw how the weight made the structure collapse faster. When the Vorax sealed their shelters tighter to keep water out, he watched how heat built up inside, creating condensation that drenched them anyway. By midday, the camp was chaos. Tempers flared, accusations flew, and the survival course had devolved into an argument about which species adapted best. The reptilians hissed that the air was poisoned. The avians claimed the soil was cursed. The insectoids whispered that invisible parasites were eating through their resin. Evan said nothing. He walked to the edge of the camp, where the trees grew thickest, and crouched beneath a giant root that arched like a bridge. The air there was cooler. Droplets ran down the bark in narrow rivulets. He ran a finger through the water and felt the slick texture of the resinous film that coated everything. It wasn't just moisture, it was life. Microscopic and unrelenting. Anything that stayed still too long became food for it. He leaned against the trunk, looking upward. The canopy was 100 meters high, a layered maze of leaves and vines. Sunlight filtered through in trembling shards, painting the mist in shades of gold and green. For a moment he closed his eyes and imagined the ancient explorers of Earth's rainforests, men who had crossed the Amazon with nothing but machetes and hammocks. They hadn't fought the jungle, they had learned its rhythm. Perhaps the same principle applied here. When he returned to the camp at dusk, the others were rebuilding again. He offered no advice this time, only watched. The Zyri were now drying their leaves over a fire before layering them, hoping to remove moisture. The Threxians had dug a pit to anchor the base of their structure, but as soon as they stepped away, water began to seep in. The Vorax had spread resin along the bark of nearby trees, trying to create a canopy barrier, but the resin already showed signs of softening. Every attempt was a repetition of the same mistake. Fighting the jungle instead of cooperating with it. Evan sat beside his small campfire, letting the smoke coil around him. His shelter was nothing more than a canvas sheet stretched between two trees, slanted enough for the water to run off. The others had mocked it for being too open, but he had chosen airflow over dryness. The fire's smoke mixed with the damp air, keeping insects away and slowing the growth of mold on his gear. He had arranged his sleeping area slightly above ground level, using 2 large branches and his backpack as a pillow. It wasn't comfortable, but it was dry enough to rest. By midnight, thunder rolled through the jungle. The sky opened up, and the rain came not as a drizzle, but as a flood. The cadets' shelters groaned and crumpled under the pressure. Screams echoed through the darkness as cold water poured into every corner. Evan sat up, pulling his tarp tighter and angling it to divert the flow. Within minutes, mud rivers carved paths through the camp. Lights flickered, then vanished. When dawn came, the jungle looked different, cleaner, emptier. The cadets' shelters were gone, reduced to flattened heaps of soaked material. The morning air was still. Steam rose from the ground as sunlight returned. Evan stepped out barefoot, feeling the warmth of the mud against his skin. He saw Velra sitting on a broken branch, her wings drooping. "Everything we built," she whispered, "gone in one night." He nodded. "Everything built against the jungle," he replied quietly. "Maybe it's time to build with it." She looked at him, puzzled, but he didn't elaborate. He walked toward the edge of the clearing again, observing how the water drained along certain natural slopes. The jungle wasn't cruel, it was consistent. It destroyed what didn't belong. Anything that resisted its rhythm was doomed to fail. By the end of the first day, every cadet had accepted that the challenge was no longer about strength or technology. It was about humility. The human was the only one not rebuilding. He spent his time observing the trees, tracing the direction of the wind, noting which branches stayed dry and which surfaces stayed cool. When night fell again, the camp was silent except for the endless hum of insects. Evan lay under his tarp, eyes open, listening. Somewhere in that rhythm, the dripping, the buzzing, the crackling of distant thunder, he began to hear a pattern, not of chaos, but of cooperation. The jungle was alive, and it whispered to those patient enough to listen. That night, while others twisted in their damp beds, Evan drifted into light sleep, already forming a plan. The jungle had stripped every cadet of comfort, but it had also offered him an invitation to learn its language. And once he did, he knew he would never fear it again. By the third sunrise, the jungle smelled stronger than ever. The air carried a pungent mixture of sap, decay, and damp roots, a perfume of life and death intertwined. The camp that once looked like a bustling colony now resembled a graveyard of half-buried dreams. Branches jutted from the mud like bones. Patches of fungus glowed faintly blue under the morning shade, feeding on what had been the cadets' proud shelters. The ground was spongy, breathing beneath every step, as if the jungle itself exhaled through the soil. Evan moved quietly through this ruin, his boots leaving deep prints that filled instantly with water. He could almost hear the planet laughing at their arrogance. He had slept little again, but his mind was sharp. The others were beginning to fall apart, some physically, some mentally. The reptilian Threxian commander, Koresh, paced in frustration, muttering that the conditions were unfair, that no living being could adapt to such an environment. His scales had begun to peel in the humidity, revealing raw patches underneath. Velra, the avian cadet who had been so proud of her craftsmanship, now sat beside the ashes of her fire, staring at her claws, her feathers limp and mottled with mildew. Even the insectoid Vorax, who were naturally suited for warm climates, were struggling. Their resin excretions softened in the constant moisture, and their once rigid limbs now trembled from exhaustion. Evan watched without judgment. He wasn't immune to fatigue, but he understood something that others hadn't grasped yet. The jungle didn't destroy out of malice. It reclaimed. Everything that touched the ground became a part of it again. Fighting decay was like trying to stop breathing. He needed a different approach. After breakfast, which consisted of stale ration cubes soaked in water to make them chewable, the cadets gathered to discuss strategy. The instructors had not returned for 3 days. The survival exam was designed to be fully autonomous. That meant no help, no new supplies, and no pity. The aliens argued for hours. Some suggested moving the camp deeper into the jungle to find higher ground. Others wanted to build new shelters from bark, which they believed was more durable than leaves. Evan stayed silent until Velra turned to him and asked sharply, "You've been observing, human. Do you have anything useful to say?" He looked at her calmly. "Yes," he said, his voice low but steady. "Stop trying to make the jungle obey. Start using what it offers." The others exchanged confused glances. Koresh scoffed, his tongue flicking in irritation. "Philosophy will not keep us dry, human. You speak as if the trees will protect you out of kindness." Evan met his cold reptilian eyes. "They will, if I build the right way," he said simply, then turned and walked away from the circle. He spent the rest of the morning alone, exploring the edges of the clearing. The jungle was endlessly alive. Every root he touched pulsed faintly with moisture. Every vine crawled with tiny insects. Every fallen leaf was already breaking down into threads of life. He knelt near a rotting log, touching the fungus that spread across it in delicate white webs. It was soft, warm, and fragrant. He realized that the faster something decayed here, the more energy it released. Decay wasn't destruction, it was transformation. If he could channel that energy instead of resisting it, he might survive comfortably. He began experimenting. Using his knife, he cut a few thick vines and tied them between 2 tall trees, pulling until they hummed under tension. The surface was slick, so he rubbed the vines with ash from his fire, drying them slightly. The more he handled them, the more he felt their strength. Unlike wood, they flexed and breathed with the air. He imagined weaving them together into something that didn't need to fight gravity or humidity, a shelter that floated above the rot. By midday, his hands were scratched, his clothes damp, and his shoulders ached, but he had gathered enough materials to start. He twisted the vines into cords and stretched them tighter, testing how much weight they could hold. When one snapped, he didn't curse. He noted how the break happened and adjusted his knot. Slowly, a shape began to emerge between the 2 trees, a web of interlocking cords. The others watched from a distance, puzzled. Velra tilted her head and whispered to Koresh, "He's building a trap." Koresh hissed a laugh. Perhaps for himself. Evan ignored them. He continued weaving until the structure took on the rough outline of a net wide enough to lie on. He tied the corners higher and tested the bounce with his hand. It held firm. Then he layered large leaves on top, each overlapping the other like scales. The air flowed beneath freely, keeping it dry. The shade above filtered sunlight in speckled patterns, leaving his work area cool. By the time the sun began to sink, he had created the first prototype of what he later called his hammock. He stepped back, admiring it with quiet satisfaction. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The others, however, laughed openly now. "The human has built a swing," Velra said with mocking amusement. "Will you sing lullabies to yourself tonight?" Evan smiled faintly. "Maybe," he said. "But I'll be dry when I do." That night, the jungle performed its usual symphony, raindrops tapping leaves, frogs croaking in unseen puddles, and the distant growl of predators hunting in the dark. Most cadets retreated to their damp shelters, already resigned to another miserable night. Evan climbed into his hammock carefully, letting his weight settle into the woven vines. It swayed slightly, and the sound of rain softened beneath him. The air below was cool and fresh. The ground's stench of rot couldn't reach him. For the first time since landing on Varela 3, he closed his eyes without flinching. When dawn came, he woke dry. Not completely comfortable, his back ached from the uneven weave, but dry. He sat up and stretched, looking down at the others still curled up on the wet ground. Koresh's tent had collapsed again during the night, and the Voraks were busy scraping mold off their gear. Velra stumbled from her shelter, shaking water from her wings, and froze when she saw Evan's elevated bed. He greeted her casually, sipping from a small bamboo tube he had cut open to collect rainwater. Her beak clicked. "You actually slept?" she asked incredulously. He nodded. "Best night since we arrived." She examined his creation with narrowed eyes. "You built that from vines?" "Yes." "It didn't rot?" "Not yet. It breathes. The air keeps it dry." She said nothing more, but he saw something shift in her expression. Not respect, but curiosity, the first seed of understanding. Throughout the day, Evan refined his design. He replaced weak vines with stronger ones, adjusting the knots for balance. He learned that certain vines produced a natural oil that resisted water, and he used those for the outer layers. He also discovered that rubbing charcoal dust into the fibers made them more durable. The smell of smoke clung to his hands, and he welcomed it. It kept insects away. By evening, his hammock had become more than a bed. It was a statement of defiance, but not against the jungle, against ignorance. The cadets still tried to rebuild their old shelters, layering bark and sealing cracks with resin, repeating the same mistakes. Evan watched them briefly, then turned back to his work. He didn't need walls or floors. The jungle already provided the perfect structure, trees, spaced just far enough apart to hold him, high enough to catch the breeze. He added a simple canopy made from overlapping palm leaves, angled so that water rolled down into a small basin he dug beside one tree. Slowly, his corner of the camp began to look different. Not a ruin, but a living space. That night, the air was heavy again, but Evan didn't mind. He lay in his hammock, swaying gently while the rain drummed above. The sound was rhythmic, hypnotic. He thought of home, of Earth's humid forests, of explorers who once learned the same lessons under dripping canopies. He felt connected to them through time, a lineage of humans who thrived where others saw only danger. When lightning flashed across the sky, he caught a glimpse of Velra standing under her broken shelter, staring at him from afar. Her feathers glistened with water, her eyes unreadable. For a long moment, she said nothing, then turned away. He knew she would try something new tomorrow. Evan closed his eyes again, the faint scent of rain-soaked soil rising beneath him. The jungle still whispered and groaned, but now it seemed less hostile. He understood it a little more with each breath. Everything that rotted, everything that broke, taught him what to avoid. He wasn't conquering the jungle, he was learning its rules. And once he understood those rules completely, he knew he would no longer just survive. He would build something that lasted. The fourth morning brought a rare silence. The rain had stopped during the night, leaving the jungle suspended in shimmering mist. Every leaf was jeweled with water, and beams of pale sunlight streamed through the canopy, cutting through the haze like liquid glass. The camp looked transformed, though not in the way the cadets hoped. The shelters that still stood sagged like drowned corpses. The ground was soft and steaming, the smell of rot stronger than ever. But one small corner of the clearing, Evan's corner, was different. His hammock swayed gently between two trees, its woven surface glistening in the sun, but perfectly intact. Beneath it, the mud was almost dry. Evan woke early, his muscles stiff, but his mind alert. The night had been peaceful. He had slept above the ground, safe from the crawling insects and the suffocating damp. The steady rocking of his hammock had lulled him into a deep, uninterrupted rest, something none of the others had enjoyed since the mission began. He rubbed his eyes, sat up, and watched the mist curl through the trees like smoke. He knew the others would soon gather around to inspect what had once been the object of their mockery. The first to approach was Velra. She moved slowly, her feathers still heavy from humidity, but her posture more curious than defensive. She had spent the night trying to sleep under an improvised canopy, and dark circles under her eyes betrayed the result. Evan greeted her with a faint nod. "Morning," he said softly. She tilted her head, eyeing the hammock. "You slept again?" she asked. "Yes," he replied. "It's not perfect, but it works." He swung his legs over and dropped lightly to the ground. The soil squished beneath his boots, and he noticed how his feet sank while the ground under the hammock stayed firm. Velra extended a clawed hand to touch one of the supporting vines. She pressed lightly, testing the tension. "You wove this yourself?" she asked. "Every knot," he said. "The trick is to use what the jungle already makes strong. These vines are alive. They move with the air, not against it. Koresh arrived next, his scales dull and cracked, his expression sour. He had refused to admit defeat, but his shelter had collapsed twice in one night, and his patience was gone. "You are proud of your string bed," he hissed, his voice low. "You think this makes you superior?" Evan met his glare calmly. "No," he said. "It makes me dry." Koresh's nostrils flared, but before he could reply, another cadet, a small Vorax with amber-colored eyes, approached. "Human," the insectoid said. "You sleep above ground, yes? How do you avoid the cold?" Evan smiled faintly. "It's warmer up there. The air circulates and the ground stays cool. You should try it." The exchange attracted more attention. Soon, several cadets surrounded his setup, examining it from every angle. Some poked the vines skeptically. Others sniffed the leaves, as if trying to decode their secret. Evan didn't boast. He simply explained what he had learned, how air prevented moisture from settling, how movement discouraged mold, and how certain plants released natural oils that repelled insects. He even showed them how to weave knots that tightened when wet instead of loosening. At first, the others listened in silence. Then curiosity overtook pride. Velra was the first to imitate him. She climbed up between two trees and began stringing vines with clumsy precision, her feathers brushing against the bark. Evan watched her work, stepping forward only when she tied a knot incorrectly. "No, twist it once more," he said. "Like this." She followed his guidance, and soon the pattern held. When she finished, she stepped back and looked uncertain. "It doesn't look very stable," she said. "Lie down," he replied. "You'll see." She hesitated but obeyed, carefully lowering herself onto the woven surface. The hammock shifted under her weight, creaking softly, then steadied. Her feathers rustled as she adjusted, and a surprised smile appeared on her face. "It holds," she said quietly. Evan nodded. "It always does if the tension is right." By midday, a few others had begun building their own hammocks, each with different materials and shapes. The camp buzzed with energy again. Not frustration this time, but discovery. The Vorax experimented with resin-coated vines, while the reptilians used tougher fibers from the inner bark of the trees. The sound of weaving replaced the noise of arguments. The jungle, for the first time since their arrival, seemed to hum in rhythm with them. Evan worked separately, fine-tuning his own design. He added a second layer of leaves beneath his main frame, creating an insulating pocket of air. Then he hung small pouches filled with herbs and ash around the area. The scent masked the human smell that often attracted insects and predators. He also used strips of bark to create a narrow walkway leading to his hammock so that he wouldn't have to step into the mud. Each adjustment made his small space more livable. By evening, a strange calm had fallen over the camp. Fires crackled in several corners, and the air carried the scent of cooked rations mixed with the earth's perfume. Evan sat near his hammock, sipping from a bamboo tube, while Velra perched above him, adjusting the angle of her canopy. "You humans," she said, her voice half teasing, half curious. "You adapt fast." He looked up at her and smiled faintly. "We had to. Back home, nature doesn't wait for you to understand it. You learn fast, or you die fast." Velra tilted her head, considering his words. "Perhaps your planet is cruel," she said. "Or perhaps your species simply doesn't know when to give up." He chuckled quietly. "Maybe both." That night, the transformation was undeniable. One by one, the cadets tested their hammocks. Some were crude, some elegant, but all were better than the collapsing shelters of days before. The sound of complaints was replaced by the creaking of vines and the faint laughter of relief. For the first time, the camp was not a scene of despair, but of progress. Evan lay back under his canopy, the glow of firelight dancing across his face. The stars were invisible through the dense canopy, but he didn't need to see them. The jungle itself was alive with soft luminescence, the glow of fungi, the shimmer of beetle shells, the faint pulse of airborne spores that glowed like dust in moonlight. The humidity was still intense, but now it felt like part of the atmosphere rather than an enemy. He closed his eyes, the hammock swaying gently beneath him, and listened to the new sound of the camp. Restful silence. Sometime during the night, thunder rumbled again in the distance. A storm was coming. Evan awoke just before the first drops fell. He adjusted the leaves above him, tightening the edges of his canopy. The rain came harder, a furious cascade of sound, but the water rolled cleanly off the slanted leaves and collected in his basin below. He smiled in the dark. It was working exactly as he planned. When morning broke again, the storm had passed, and sunlight returned in sharp beams. The camp was still intact. Hammocks swung lazily in the breeze, dripping but not broken. The others stirred, stretching and murmuring in disbelief. Koresh was the first to stand, his eyes wide with something that looked like respect. "Your method," he said gruffly. "It worked." Evan nodded. "It worked because the jungle allowed it." Velra descended from her hammock, shaking her feathers dry. "You said this place could teach us," she said. "I think I am beginning to understand." Evan smiled slightly, then turned toward the tree line. "It's not finished yet," he said. "We can do better." He walked away, scanning the higher branches, the direction of the wind, and the play of light filtering through the canopy. His mind was already moving ahead. How to create shade that grew on its own. How to use the plants not as tools, but as partners. The others watched him disappear into the trees, the quiet confidence of his steps leaving a trail of purpose behind him. That evening, when he returned, his hands carried new treasures, clusters of vine-like roots with thick leaves, fragrant herbs, and small seeds he had found sprouting near a fallen log. He laid them out beside his hammock and began sorting them carefully. Velra approached, curiosity glimmering in her eyes. "You are building something new?" she asked. "Always," he said, smiling. "The jungle never stops changing. Neither should we." As darkness fell, he wove the first strands of his next experiment. His hammock swayed gently in the warm night breeze, its surface glowing faintly with spores that clung to the vines like a constellation. Above him, the jungle whispered with approval, as if recognizing him not as an intruder, but as a student who was finally learning its language. The jungle had accepted him now. That much was clear. Every sound, every scent, every flicker of movement blended into a rhythm that no longer felt hostile. Evan had learned to hear it like a pulse beneath the ground. The cadets still worked on their shelters, improving what he had shown them, but his mind was already reaching further. The hammock was no longer just a place to sleep. It was a foundation. He wanted to make it self-sustaining, a living shelter that breathed, cooled, and provided for him. The air on Varela 3 was too heavy to fight. He would have to let the jungle itself do the work. At dawn, he climbed one of the tallest nearby trees. The bark was slick, but solid beneath his hands. From the higher branches, the view opened like a secret. Endless green spread in every direction, steam rising from the forest floor in ghostly ribbons. The humidity shimmered, and the sunlight fractured into soft beams that made the entire world glow. Up here, the air was cooler and drier. He realized that the upper layers of the canopy caught most of the condensation before it reached the ground. That was the key. Height. The jungle punished what stayed low, but rewarded what reached upward. He descended with new purpose. When he landed, Velra was waiting for him, perched on a branch, her feathers glinting faintly in the filtered light. "You were gone long," she said. "The others thought you'd fallen." He smiled faintly. "No, I was thinking." She tilted her head, half amused. "You humans think too much." He shrugged. "It's how we survive." He spent the rest of the morning collecting broad leaves and thin vines with soft, porous surfaces. He also gathered pieces of bark that held water and patches of moss that seemed to stay moist no matter how hot it became. With slow precision, he began layering these materials across the top of his canopy, weaving them into the structure itself. Velra watched from her perch, her wings half open. "You're covering your roof," she said. "Won't that trap heat?" Evan shook his head. "Not if it's alive." When he finished, the new layer looked strange, uneven, rough, and overgrown. But that was intentional. He planted a few of the small seedlings he had found during his earlier explorations along the top, tucking them into natural pockets of moss. He drizzled a small amount of the water he had collected from the basin to moisten the surface. Then he waited. The others might not have understood, but he had seen enough of this world to trust that life grew fast here. By evening, the first signs appeared. The leaves above his shelter absorbed the sunlight and shimmered faintly, releasing a fresh, cool scent into the air. Condensation began forming on their surfaces, dripping down in rhythmic patterns. The droplets rolled along grooves he had carved with his knife, flowing neatly into the collection basin below. The air beneath his canopy grew noticeably cooler, fresher. He lay back in his hammock that night, gazing upward at his work, and for the first time he didn't feel like he was surviving. He felt like he was living. The next morning, the camp stirred with surprise. The cadets noticed the faint greenery sprouting across the top of his shelter. Velra was the first to approach again, climbing gracefully onto his canopy to inspect it. Her claws pressed gently into the moss. "It's growing," she said, wonder in her voice. "You've made the jungle part of your shelter." Evan smiled up at her. "No," he said, "I made myself part of the jungle." Throughout the day, others came to see what he had done. The Voraks were fascinated by how the condensation system worked, clicking their mandibles in admiration. Koresh inspected it silently, his reptilian eyes narrowing as he ran a claw along the bark channels. "You use the water to feed the plants," he said. "The plants cool the air, and the air keeps your hammock dry." He looked at Evan, a rare glint of respect crossing his features. "Efficient," Evan nodded. "Nature already had the design. I just followed it." As the days passed, the roof garden flourished. The seedlings took root, their vines extending along the canopy like green veins. Tiny flowers bloomed, releasing faint bioluminescence at night. It bathed his entire corner of the camp in a soft amber glow. Insects avoided the plants, repelled by their scent, and the air remained refreshingly cool even during the hottest hours. Evan's shelter had transformed into something almost magical, a living organism that sustained itself. The others began calling it the Human Oasis. He didn't mind the nickname. He spent his evenings maintaining the garden, trimming the vines, redirecting the water flow, and studying how each plant reacted to light. Velra often sat nearby, helping him collect seeds or adjusting the leaves. She was fascinated by the quiet patience with which he worked. "On my world," she said one night, "we build with speed. Nothing lasts long, so we build again and again. But you humans, you build like you expect to stay." Evan smiled, his hand still busy tying a knot. "That's the point," he said softly. "We stay because we make things that last." Over time, his design began to influence the entire camp. One by one, the other cadets tried to imitate parts of his shelter. Some planted vines over their roofs for shade. Others used the moss to line their sleeping areas. The atmosphere of competition had faded. Now there was collaboration. The once divided group had begun exchanging materials, sharing discoveries, and working together in ways the instructors had not anticipated. Evan had not meant to lead anyone, but leadership came naturally when others began to trust his results. One afternoon, as he was adjusting the slope of his water channels, he noticed something unexpected. Small creatures, tiny amphibians with translucent skin, had begun nesting inside the damp moss along his roof. They chirped softly, blending into the jungle sounds. Instead of removing them, he left them alone. Their presence meant his microenvironment was stable enough to support life. That realization filled him with quiet pride. His shelter had become an ecosystem. The nights grew calmer after that. The endless rain still came, but it no longer felt like punishment. Evan would lie in his hammock, listening to the steady rhythm of droplets hitting the leaves above. The bioluminescent glow from the flowers painted faint ripples across his skin, and the scent of herbs filled the air. Sometimes Velra would perch nearby, softly grooming her feathers in the golden light. The others had begun sleeping earlier, exhaustion giving way to peace. For the first time, the jungle seemed to cradle them instead of consuming them. Weeks passed unnoticed. The exam that had once felt like a desperate fight for survival had turned into something almost sacred. Each morning brought new discoveries. Plants that purified water, insects that could be harvested for resin, roots that burned cleanly for fire. The cadets were no longer students. They had become participants in the jungle's vast, interconnected rhythm. Evan's living shelter had been the turning point, the catalyst that made them see Varela 3 not as an enemy, but as a teacher. One evening, as the sun dipped below the treetops, Velra approached him quietly. Her feathers were brighter now, healthier. She looked around his green canopy and smiled softly. "You've made a home," she said, "not just for yourself, but for the rest of us." Evan looked up from the plant he was tending. "We all had to learn it," he said. "The jungle doesn't reward strength, it rewards understanding." Later that night, when everyone slept, Evan remained awake. He gazed at the stars barely visible through the dense foliage. their faint light mingling with the soft glow of his garden. He thought about how easily things had shifted, from chaos to harmony, from fear to cooperation. The jungle's humidity still hung thick in the air, but now it felt like breath rather than burden. He realized that what he had built was more than a shelter. It was proof that survival was not about endurance alone. It was about adaptation, empathy, and balance. When the first light of dawn touched the leaves, the droplets shimmered like tiny diamonds. Birds sang somewhere high above, and the amphibians chirped softly among the moss. Evan stretched in his hammock, feeling the cool air swirl around him, and smiled. His roof garden had become a living crown, a gentle reminder that the jungle could be tamed, not by force, but by understanding its heart. The jungle awoke that morning in golden silence. Mist rolled lazily above the treetops, and the air felt lighter than usual, as though the entire planet had exhaled after weeks of holding its breath. Evan stirred in his hammock, blinking against the soft glow filtering through the roof garden. Dewdrops glistened on the leaves above him like diamonds scattered by the dawn. The gentle creak of vines and the faint chorus of frogs welcomed him into wakefulness. He stretched, feeling the familiar coolness of the air beneath his shelter and the steady pulse of life that now surrounded him. Everything was alive, and everything worked in perfect balance. He sat up slowly, observing his surroundings with quiet satisfaction. The plants above had thickened into a lush canopy, their roots weaving into the structure so completely that the line between built and grown no longer existed. Small amphibians hopped between leaves, and a pair of bioluminescent insects hovered lazily near the vines, leaving trails of light in their wake. His water channels flowed steadily, dripping into the basin below, where the surface shimmered with reflected sunlight. What had begun as a desperate survival project had become something magnificent, a small ecosystem designed not by dominance, but by understanding. The other cadets had gathered nearby, some already tending to their own hybrid shelters inspired by his design. Velra was balancing gracefully on a branch, cleaning her feathers while humming a low melody. Koresh was sharpening a blade made from hardened bark resin, his earlier hostility long gone, replaced by a quiet respect for the human who had changed everything. When Evan climbed down, the group turned toward him almost instinctively. No one spoke of leadership, but everyone waited for his next move. "Today is the last day," he said, his voice calm and steady. "The retrieval shuttle will arrive by dusk." The words carried both relief and sadness. The jungle had become more than a test. It had become a home, a teacher, and, in a strange way, a companion. Velra spread her wings slightly, glancing around the camp. "It feels wrong to leave it," she said softly. "As if we're abandoning something alive." Evan nodded. "We are, but maybe we're supposed to. That's how lessons work. You learn, you leave, and you carry them with you." The cadets spent the morning dismantling what could be packed and documenting what could not. The instructors would want proof of adaptation, so Evan carefully recorded sketches and data. Humidity levels beneath the roof garden, temperature differences, and the growth rates of the plants he had cultivated. He worked meticulously, every line drawn with purpose. Velra helped him collect samples, cutting small segments of vines and wrapping them in dried leaves to preserve them for the return trip. "When you first arrived," she said, "you looked so unsure. Now you move like the jungle itself taught you how." He smiled faintly. Maybe it did. As the sun climbed higher, the heat returned, but it no longer felt oppressive. The air beneath his canopy remained cool, the scent of green life filling every breath. He sat for a moment beside his hammock, tracing the pattern of its knots with his fingers. The vines had hardened over time, strengthened by the constant motion and moisture. It was no longer just a bed. It was a piece of living architecture. He thought of how it had begun, a crude net woven from desperation. Now it was a throne of sorts, suspended in the air, surrounded by life he had nurtured. The others gathered for a final meal before departure. Using leaves as plates, they shared roasted roots and fruit that had ripened under the filtered light of the canopy. The atmosphere was calm, almost reverent. No one argued, no one complained. Even Koresh, once the loudest critic, spoke with quiet pride. "I came here thinking strength would keep me alive," he said, his voice low. "But the jungle broke me and rebuilt me in its image. I owe that lesson to the human." Evan shook his head. "You owe it to the jungle," he said. "It just needed someone foolish enough to listen first." Velra laughed softly. "You call yourself foolish, but you're the only one who thrived." He looked at her and shrugged. "Foolishness is the first step to understanding. You have to believe you know nothing before the world decides to teach you." The afternoon passed slowly. The sun turned orange behind the mist, and the sounds of the jungle grew louder, the chirping, the rustling, the deep hum that never truly stopped. As the light dimmed, Evan climbed into his hammock one last time. He lay back and stared up at the living roof he had grown with his own hands. The leaves swayed gently, releasing droplets that landed cool on his skin. He closed his eyes and breathed in the earthy air, letting it fill him with a kind of peace he had never known before. A sharp mechanical hum cut through the stillness. The retrieval shuttle descended through the canopy, its thrusters scattering mist and leaves. The cadets shielded their eyes as the landing lights pierced the shadows. The instructors stepped out, their sterile uniforms and equipment seeming almost alien in contrast to the natural harmony of the jungle. One of them, a tall woman with silver insignia on her chest, surveyed the camp with disbelief. "Remarkable," she murmured. "You've turned the environment into an ally." She turned to Evan. "You did this." He nodded once. "Not alone. The jungle helped." The instructor smiled faintly, though her expression held a trace of confusion. "The report will say otherwise," she said. "Humans always find a way to adapt." Evan looked around at the others, their hammocks, their living shelters, their calm faces. "No," he replied quietly. "Humans find a way to listen." Before leaving, he took one final walk through the clearing. The plants rustled softly as he passed, and the small amphibians chirped from his roof garden. The vines seemed to lean toward him, alive with the rhythm of wind and breath. He reached up and touched one of the leaves gently, feeling the moisture gather against his palm. "Thank you," he whispered, unsure whether he was speaking to the jungle, to himself, or to something larger that connected both. When he stepped onto the shuttle ramp, Velra turned to look back one last time. "Will it survive without us?" she asked. Evan followed her gaze toward the green world they were leaving behind. "It always has," he said. "But maybe it'll remember that for a while, we learned to live with it." The shuttle lifted from the ground, its engines stirring the canopy below. Leaves spiraled upward, glinting in the last light of the sun before falling back into the shadows. From above, the camp disappeared into the endless green, his roof garden blending seamlessly into the jungle's vast crown. No trace remained of the struggle, only harmony. Hours later, as the shuttle broke through the planet's atmosphere, the cadets sat in silence. The hum of the engines filled the space, but none of them spoke. Each of them stared through the viewport, watching Varela 3 shrink into a brilliant emerald sphere. Evan leaned back in his seat, exhausted yet deeply content. The jungle's rhythm still echoed in his mind. The drip of water, the rustle of leaves, the heartbeat of life. It was a sound he knew he would never forget. When the Academy's station finally appeared against the blackness of space, the cadets straightened, preparing for debriefing. The instructors would ask for reports, explanations, and statistics, but none of those numbers could capture what had really happened down there. Evan didn't care if they called him a leader or an anomaly. He knew the truth. He had gone into the jungle as a student of survival and left as a student of life itself. Later, when he stood before the review panel, his report was simple. "The jungle's humidity broke every shelter," he began. "But when I stopped fighting it, I learned to build differently. I built a hammock, a roof garden, and I slept like a king. Not because I conquered the jungle, but because I stopped trying to." The room was silent for a moment before the senior examiner spoke. "You passed the exam, Cadet Clark," she said. "But more than that, you've redefined what survival means." That night, back in his quarters, Evan lay awake staring at the stars through the observation window. The sterile hum of the air filters could not replace the pulse of the jungle, but he closed his eyes and imagined the sounds of dripping water and rustling leaves. Somewhere far below, on the surface of Varela 3, his roof garden continued to grow, untouched, living proof that harmony was stronger than resistance. He smiled softly, whispering into the dark, "I didn't survive you, old friend. I became part of you." And with that thought, he drifted into the deepest, calmest sleep he had ever known. No longer a survivor, but a master of balance, the quiet king of the jungle.